Jordan Peterson's recent appearance on the Joe Rogan show revealed some astonishing plans he has to end the World Economic Forum. Peterson announced the launching of an alternative consortium in London that will be meeting in the next coming months and which will invite world leaders and businesses to reimagine the future apart from the apocalyptic and technocratic tyranny of the demons in Davos. And in so doing, Peterson showed that he is absolutely tracking with the rise of a far more traditionalist conservative world that's already redefining the world order away from our secular globalist elite.
I set up an international consortium based in London. I can't tell you all the details yet, but we're trying to put together something like an alternative vision of the future, say an alternative to that kind of apocalyptic narrative that's being put forward, at least implicitly, by organizations like the WEF, and that's the virginal planet, rapacious tyrant, all devouring consumer religion.
Let's stop there for just a quick second, because I think this is what makes Peterson's analysis so impressive. He recognizes that there's a kind of religiously inspired mythology behind the WEF, a mythology that depicts the human race as a threat to the planet. Humanity, under the guise of industrialization, which entailed patriarchy, racism, and colonization, humanity has radically disrupted the original state of the environment, which WEF propagandists envision as a primeval ecological utopia. And in the name of restoring this primeval ecological utopia, the behavior of humanity must be radically regulated and engineered by a cooperation between big business and big government. And a number of scholars, the vast majority of which are on the political left, they're recognizing the dangers that this mythology poses to the world. British sociologist Colin Crouch refers to our world as increasingly post-democratic, and Professor Joel Kotkin is describing it as the rise of what he calls neo-feudalism. Regardless, they both see the radical dangers towards a free society posed by the growing alliance between big business and big government, the most important of which is the virtual eradication of localized control over political and economic decision-making. That's the future that Peterson is actively taking a stand against with his alternative to the WEF.
And it's more like something like, we want to ask people 6 key questions. Okay, so how do we get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost as rapidly as possible to the largest number of people around the world? That's one question. And so there's a presumption in the question, and here's one of the presumptions. You don't get to save the planet by making energy prices so expensive that no one poor can afford them. That's off the table. So if you want to develop alternative energy sources, no problem. Because, hey, man, the more energy sources we have, the better. But you don't get to impose your utopian vision in the service of your narcissism on the poor. We're going to try to make the poor rich, kind of try to alleviate absolute poverty.
So here in this first question on how to get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost as rapidly as possible to the largest number of people around the world, here Peterson is echoing the work of the Danish statistician Bjorn Lomborg, Marianne Tupy at the Cato Institute, and African entrepreneur Magatte Wade, and many others. But what they all have in common is the recognition that technological progress and environmental health are not at odds. Innovation, particularly voluntary entrepreneurial innovation, particularly in the realm of research and development, is the key to solving environmental issues, not top-down government mandates, which in the end are doomed to fail. Lomborg has pointed out that even if we did everything that the Paris Accord requires of us, every single thing required, all of that effort would amount to a reduction of temperature by the end of the century to no more than 0.5 degrees Celsius. And to add insult to injury, they don't just fail, but they make the vast majority of the world's population poor and put hundreds of millions of people in the state of what the World Bank calls food insecurity. Peterson's proposing the precise opposite. Let's push for industrialization and technological innovation to continue to lift populations out of poverty, good old-fashioned capitalism, particularly like we've seen in China and Singapore and are seeing now in nations like Rwanda, while at the same time investing in all kinds of alternative green energies that will be voluntarily and widely embraced if found to be cheaper, cleaner, and more abundant than fossil fuels.
Pro-human view on environmental stewardship front. That's the next question. What are the major problems that are confronting us? How do we take a sophisticated multidimensional view of that? How do we prioritize our attempts to establish our states and our international relationships properly so that we prioritize human well-being, in harmony with nature to the degree that's possible, but human-focused and not predicated on the idea that there are too many goddamn mouths on the planet to feed and that you're evil if you just think about having children. So then on the governance front, this is where it gets kind of more left-wing, I would say, is none of the people involved in this consortium so far are very thrilled with global corporate fascist government media and corporation collusion. And we're seeing this at the high end. It's like a Tower of Babel, is that the powerful players in the world are increasingly collaborating to impose a top-down vision of the future on everyone. And that's a future that's predicated on a zero-growth model. And the idea that, well, we'd need 5 planets really to support everyone at the current standard of living that obtains in the West. So the best pathway forward is to deny loans by the World Bank to developing countries so they can't develop, energy sources, which all that'll mean is they're going to burn wood and coal, obviously. So that's the third question is, how do we arrange systems of governance to stop the march of something like pathological gigantism? This is why I like people like Russell Brand and also you to some degree politically, because you guys are very, what would you say, sensitive to the danger of that kind of corrupt collusion, that regulatory capture that occurs when corporate entities and media entities and governmental entities are all in bed together, like the FDA and the CDC and so forth and so on without end.
Ah, there's the populism. That, whether Peterson or Rogan recognize it or not, that is a perfect description of the massive, growing populist revolt going on all over the world, but primarily in the West. We've talked about it on a number of occasions on our channel, but when all is said and done, our age is characterized by a political divide that's no longer an ideological divide between liberals versus conservatives per se, or Republicans versus Democrats, or the right versus the left. The new divide is a divide between the people versus the permanent political class. It's a divide between the ruled and rulers, right? The ordinary American versus oligarchs. In many respects, it's a class division where the values, interests, and concerns of the people are growing increasingly alienated from the values, interests, and concerns of an elite and exclusive managerial class of political, economic, and media oligarchs who together constitute what's increasingly being called the uniparty. And the key here is that alienation is causing the managerial class to enforce their values, interests, concerns onto the wider population through coercive means, since the people are increasingly rebelling against their rule. And so the more the distance, the dissonance widens between the people versus the political class, the more the political class has to rely on coercion as a means of maintaining their political power. But the more they coerce, the more people rise up. And that's exactly what Peterson and Rogan represent. Hey, gang, with all of this freakiness going on with the WEF, my family and I have decided to declare 2023 as the year of family preparedness in the Turley household. I'm starting off this year covering all my bases: food, storage, survival kits, and everything my family needs to make sure that we'll survive whatever the upcoming year throws at us. I recently interviewed TJ Johnson, the founder and CEO of Ready Project Food Supply. And if you haven't watched that interview, you've got to, because I'll link it down below for you. It's this interview will single-handedly tell you why I'm placing preparedness at the top of my priorities. And I invite you to join me this year in my resolution of family preparedness and take the immediate steps to get yourself and your family prepared today so you can eat tomorrow. And if you act right now, you can get to take advantage of Ready Project's special offer just for my listeners with huge limited time savings. So don't wait. Click on that link below to learn more about my plan and what I'm doing to make sure my family has all the emergency essentials that'll be needed. Join me, take action, click below, and let's get our families prepared together.
The fourth question is, what do we put forward as a vision on the family policy front to facilitate the, what would you call it, the encouragement and the maintenance of long-term monogamous couples who are child-centered, and to make increasing the birth rate part of that policy, to put policies in place that would support long-term stable monogamous families, two-parent families, and child-centered. You know, because in the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. That's a responsible way of thinking about it. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what that means. And, you know, it's tricky because, like, I think the ideal has to be long-term committed monogamous heterosexual relationships. And I had a big conversation about this with Dave Rubin. You know, Rubin's gay and he's married, and him and his partner now have 2 infants, and we talked through how that was. It was a very hard thing for them to arrange, obviously. Why? Well, they're both male. So that poses a severe problem on the reproductive front, right? And so they managed that, and they have 2 infants, but it's very complex, and it's obviously not a solution to the problem of relationship and reproduction that's duplicatable across large numbers of people. It just takes too many resources. Now, I do think we have to have an ideal at the center of every concept. But the ideal can't be too rigid, you know, because people aren't perfect. You know, in my own family, there's lots of people who are divorced. In lots of people's families, there are people who are gay. You know, there are lots of people in unhappy marriages. Nobody attains the ideal. So the ideal has to be surrounded by a fringe of tolerance, but that doesn't mean you sacrifice the ideal.
Now that was very interesting. That was interesting because Joe Rogan was unusually quiet there. He wasn't so silent when it came to his guest, Matt Walsh. Rogan pushed back hard against Matt's opposition to same-sex marriage. He's not doing that here, and I have to say this to me is what happens when you get into the weeds of a philosophical or ideological disagreement over marriage like he did with Matt Walsh. Instead of dealing with the hard, cold demographic data, which Peterson does here. The simple fact of the matter is, liberal lifestyle values centered on separation between sex and procreation has resulted in an undeniable demographic implosion. All the while, conservatives and the religious are having more kids than ever before, as it were. Conservatives have an average of 1.5 children for every 1 child born to a liberal. And for those who are religiously conservative, the ratio is even greater. They have 2 children for every 1 child born to a self-identified liberal. And so we know what promotes child rearing: conservatism and religiosity. And that's where the left really struggles in all of this. The liberal left, in this sense, in the sense of procreation, represents a kind of pathology to the health and well-being constituted by conservative religionists. And it's by promoting traditionalist conceptions of the human person and social life, rooted in the sacred, rooted in loyalty to custom, culture, tradition. That's when we'll see precisely the kind of demographic flourishing that Peterson is so concerned about. But in line with this, what he concludes is absolutely fascinating. Peterson is proposing that we do precisely all of this by reawakening the biblical foundations of Western civilization.
The other question is, well, it's pretty clear that we have to live inside a story. And one story is power rules everything. But that's not a very good story. It's a very pathological story. It's more like a confession, too, if that's the story you insist upon. It's like, so you think power governs everything, do you? Okay, I know what you're like. So that's what you truly believe. See, I believe the spirit of voluntary play governs everything, not the spirit of power. It's like voluntary association. That's what we're doing in this conversation. You know, we're playing towards an end, and we're doing it voluntarily, and we're taking everybody along for the ride. No one's forced to do it. So that's the other thing. No compulsion here. It's got to be invitational. And so we're trying to work out what the story has to be. And on that front, I just finished a seminar in Miami, and the first 8 parts of it were released on the Daily Wire 3 months ago, Exodus seminar. We walked through the story of Exodus. Exodus means ex-hodos, means the way forward. So it's the archetypal narrative of progression from tyranny and chaos into the future. That's what the story is. And it lays out a vision of appropriate governance as that's an alternative to tyranny and to chaos. So in the Exodus story, so this is very germane to the notion of what might constitute a proper story. So the question that you put forward in your life is something like, what spirit should guide you as you move ahead? And you might say, well, I don't need a spirit to guide me. It's like, yeah, you don't have that option. Some spirit guides you. Might be your stomach. You might be a worshiper of the god Priapus, right? He's the god of giant erections. That's what happens if your whole identity is staked on your sexuality. It's like some spirit is going to guide you. That's life. The question is, what is the highest spirit that could guide you? So in the Exodus story, the proposition of the story is the highest spirit that could guide you is the spirit that objects to tyranny and that calls the enslaved to freedom. And that's the representation of God in Exodus. So that's what God is in the Exodus story. Now that's not all that God is in the biblical stories, but that's God in the Exodus story. And so that is the God that, if you abide by that God, then you believe that tyranny is implicitly wrong, even if you tyrannize yourself, and that there's something implicitly virtuous about striving for freedom, especially if you're enslaved. So anyways, that's the voice that speaks to Moses. And the voice tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh, the tyrant, to let his people go. That's that famous line, let my people go. But the line is actually, let my people go so that they may worship me in the desert. Okay, so anyways, God, through Moses, calls the Israelites out of tyranny, and he punishes the tyrant. And so if you believe that fate punishes tyrants, you're already immersed in the Exodus story to some degree. If you believe that tyranny is implicitly wrong, of course most Americans believe that. Okay, so now the Israelites leave the tyranny. You'd think, hey man, great, freedom, because now you're out of the tyranny. But that isn't how life works. This is why people won't drop their tyrannical presuppositions, because you go out of the tyranny into the desert, not to the promised land. Desert first. And what's the desert? Everyone's lost. No one knows which way to go. Everyone fights. Everyone turns to the worship of false idols. Everyone wants the tyrant to reassert himself. That's the situation we're in the aftermath of the death of God in the West.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I love Peterson, because he's a scholar fully immersed in the rise of what scholars today are calling a post-secular world. If we're going to find alternatives to the WEF, we cannot continue down the path of unfettered secular modernity, because that's precisely what gave us the WEF in the first place. And why? Because, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn argued, men have forgotten God. And what he meant by that is we've forgotten the Exodus story. The road out of slavery is a road towards eternity, a morally ordered liberty, precisely like what we're seeing with the demographic flourishing of traditionalist families. Conservatism, traditionalism, religiosity, truly understood in practice, ultimately lead to freedom. Liberalism, modernism, secularism ultimately enslave. This is Peterson's alternative to the World Economic Forum, where the darkness of Davos may finally be defeated by the light of truth. As always, make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button. You'll definitely want to check out my latest video on Jordan Peterson leaving Joe Rogan absolutely speechless on the Bible. You're not going to want to miss that. So make sure to click on the link, and I'll see you over there. God bless.